And Xi Jinping told Obama, okay, if you think this is the problem, why don't both of us agree? We both of us agree to demilitarize the South China Sea, and neither China nor US will set up military facilities in South China Sea. We should have seized that offer and said, good, because what we would have accomplished is we would have got China to demilitarize an area right next to China. This is a gift to the United States.
你正在看的是新加坡国立大学著名学者马凯硕教授分享的关于南海争端的第三种叙事。新加坡虽不是南海争端的当事方，但作为东盟成员国之一，又深受南海局势的影响。这一叙事与中国的叙事不一样，但和西方媒体、菲律宾等当事国的叙事也不相同。这为我们提供了一个良好的第三方观点，来深入了解南海局势更深层的原因和更宏大的视角。在这次演讲中，他揭示了一个鲜为人知的事实：当年习近平主席曾向奥巴马总统提议将南海去军事化，但这个提议被华盛顿拒绝。马凯硕援引前美国驻华大使瑞孝简的话说，美国拒绝了一个礼物。在南海这个连接东西方的海域上，全球最密集的贸易路线正川流不息。南海将成为和平之海，还是未来战场？两方媒体谁在告诉我们事实？如果当初奥巴马接受了那项提议，今天的南海还会如此紧张吗？接下来，让我们一起听听马凯硕教授的分析，关于南海和平的另一种叙事。
The reason why you could have this incredible amount of trade and interchange was because you had to have peace, right? The minute you have war, everything breaks down, there's no travel, there's no trade. So the big question, therefore, as we look ahead into the future, will the South China Sea be a zone of peace or a zone of war? And that, frankly, is going to become one of the defining questions of our time. And what I propose to do, as Martino unfortunately gave my secret away, I'll divide my remarks into three parts. First part I'll say is what is actually threatening peace in the South China Sea? Where does the threat come from? And two, and here I'll talk about the two narratives that exist. Then in part two, I'll talk about which narrative is right. And then thirdly, what can we do about it? And since I promised to give you 5 minutes, I'll finish my talk in 10 minutes or less. On part one, what exactly is the threat to peace in South China Sea? And here, very stupid, of course, if I have to be short and brusque and blunt, I have to oversimplify things and we can do the qualifications later. But there's basically a Western narrative and what I would say for shorthand form an Asian narrative. And the Western narrative is very clear, very stark, very direct. Why is there a threat of war in South China Sea? It's because China has emerged as a great power, and with China's emergence as a great power, it is now threatening its Southeast Asian neighbors. It's reinforcing the islands in the South China Sea. It has a 9-dash line claiming all of South China Sea. And of course, you saw that when Philippines took China to the tribunal, China rejected it. And and then Xi Jinping promised to demilitarize the South China Sea, and then he broke his promise. And all this you can find, by the way, in my book As China Won, all the details. So the Western narrative is very stark, very clear. And as someone who travels around the world, I can tell you that the Anglo-Saxon media makes it clear there's only one narrative, and that's the correct narrative. But then what I call the Asian narrative, again, at the risk of oversimplification, that the problem in South China Sea is really not between China and the Southeast Asian countries. Is that this region is basically becoming a pawn in a much bigger geopolitical struggle that has emerged between the United States and China. And the real threat to this region doesn't come from China's aggression or China's assertiveness. It comes from the fact that now when the United States is looking for ways and means of embarrassing or bringing down China, it's very useful to use South China Sea as a weapon against China and use everything there and say, see, all this proves that China is aggressive, assertive, duplicitous, and so on and so forth. So I hope that's made it clear. These are the two narratives. But the next question is, which narrative is right? And I can tell you that in the Western world, there's a total conviction that the Western narrative is right and there's no other narrative to consider. And what is interesting, I find, is that you cannot even get agreement on what are the facts between the two cases. So I'll give you a simple example. I've spoken to so many people in Europe and the United States. They are absolutely convinced that Xi Jinping was completely duplicitous in promising to demilitarize the South China Sea and then reneged on his promise and went ahead and militarized the South China Sea. I haven't met a single person in the West who doubts this to be the truth. But I discovered, ironically, from a former American ambassador to China, who probably will go down as one of the best ambassadors of the United States ever to China. And some people in Singapore also know him very well because he also was a US ambassador to Singapore. His name is Stapleton Roy.
Qualities all too rare in world history. The gulf between China and the United States in the early 1970s was far greater than it is now.
He actually, as a child, grew up in China, speaks Chinese fluently, understands China very deeply. And when I was doing research for my book, Has China Won?, I had a one-on-one lunch with him in Washington, D.C. And he told me, Kishore, at the meeting between Xi Jinping and Obama raised the subject of South China Sea and said, why are you being so assertive? And Xi Jinping told Obama, okay, if you think this is the problem, why don't both of us agree? We both of us agree to demilitarize the South China Sea, and neither China nor US will set up military facilities in South China Sea. And Stapleton Roy said to me, Kishore, we should have seized that offer and said, good, because what we would have accomplished is we would have got China to demilitarize an area right next to China. This is a gift to the United States. And Stapleton Roy said to me, stupidly, we rebuffed that offer and we stepped up the naval patrols. So instead of Xi Jinping being duplicitous and having reneged on his promise, he actually made an offer that was rebuffed. This is factually true, but completely unknown in the West. And what is for me shocking, I put it at the opening section of a whole chapter. I describe all this in great details, but the Anglo-Saxon media will never tell the alternative story. And one of the things that has become clear to me as I study this US-China contest very as deeply as I can, is that the Anglo-Saxon media will tell outright lies, which for many in Singapore is very hard to believe because we have become prisoners of the Anglo-Saxon media, and so we cannot accept the fact that sometimes they're telling outright lies on some issues. And so especially when it comes to South China Sea, we must learn to be very wary of all the facts. So for example, I'll give you another example. They will talk about how much China has claimed land in its features in the South China Sea. But the question is, who started this process? Was it China? Or was it the other Southeast Asian claimants? And unfortunately, the Southeast Asian claimants started it So China said, okay, if you do it, I'll do it. Only difference is that, if Malaysia can claim 20 acres, Chinese will claim 2,000 acres. So that's a game, right? So therefore, getting the facts on this case is very, very difficult. So at the end of the day, I think that we have to be very wary of the Western narrative and be clear that clearly what's happening in South China Sea is that we are now becoming sucked into a major geopolitical contest, which, by the way, will accelerate over the next 10 years, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. So the third part, therefore, is, I have 3 minutes. What do we do about it? And fortunately, there is a good answer for that. And that good answer was given by Jeffrey Sung and I, because we wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle.
Yeah.
And what is shocking is that most people in Singapore are not aware that ASEAN is a miracle. And it's a miracle because what ASEAN has done is that it's taken the most diverse corner of planet Earth. By the way, there's no corner of planet Earth which is as interesting and as diverse and as different as Southeast Asia. Because out of 670 million people in Southeast Asia, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, and then you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, you have Hindus, and fortunately, you also have lots of communists. So in Vietnam, so it's an amazing. It's frankly, paradoxically, as a child growing up in Onan Road, my dream was to go overseas to see Europe and see what I thought were the most interesting corners of planet Earth. But actually, it turns out I didn't know that I was living in Southeast Asia, which is frankly the most interesting corner of planet Earth. And so in such a place like this, which the British historians describe as the Balkans of Asia, we should be seeing more wars rather than less wars. We should not be seeing a war in Ukraine. We should be seeing a war here in Southeast Asia. The differences here are much greater. I mean, the Russians and Ukrainians share so much culture in common in every dimension. They have a deep connection with each other. Between the Muslims and the Christians, I assure you, there are huge differences. And you can see this in many parts of the world. And yet we are at peace. And this wasn't something that happened by accident. It happened because we had some really outstanding leaders, which we document in our book, in the 60s and 70s, who understood all the threats, anticipated it, and started creating this organization to deal with it. So the net result of it all is that you have today the world's second most successful regional organization called ASEAN in the world, in this region. And this is the organization that will essentially protect us from the US-China geopolitical contest. And that's why, if you look at a recent issue of the magazine Foreign Affairs, in the March-April issue, I have an article that makes a claim that if the rest of the world wants to manage the US-China contest, they can take lessons from one organization, and that organization is ASEAN. And I'm amazed that Foreign Affairs accepted that argument. But the tragedy is that while many in the rest of the world understand and appreciate ASEAN, we don't have enough people in Singapore who appreciate it. So I hope at the end of the day, you'll all join me in marketing ASEAN to Singaporeans and to the world. Thank you.
听完马凯硕教授的观点，我们会重新思考，在信息被主导、叙事被选择的时代，我们如何更接近事情的本来面貌。教授提醒我们，南海问题的关键不在于岛屿与航线，更在于我们是否能跳出叙事的框架，以更全面的视角看待中美之间竞争。他分享的一些历史细节令人印象深刻。首先，中国并非突然决定在南海变得更有企图，这场争端始于东南亚国家率先的领土声明，这试图将中国排除在外。另一方面，中国也并非因国家力量的增长 而变得更有攻击性。南海军事化和紧张的根源在于美国拒绝在南海的去军事化。他提出的结论发人深省：一、南海争端不是东南亚国家与中国的分歧，而是中美战略角力的舞台。二、美国拒绝中国的去军事化提议是加剧南海紧张的真正起点。基于这样的现实，他提到东盟是维护南海和平的关键力量，这个能在多元复杂的地区维持稳定与对话本身就是一个奇迹。同时，东盟也为更多中美以外地区的国家就如何避免卷入中美战略竞争提供一个很好样板。如果当年奥巴马总统接受了习近平主席的提议，今天的南海会不会是一片和平之海？对此你怎么看？